Hi, and welcome to this lecture on biblical perspectives on life after death. As we usually do, let's start with our larger framework questions on religions in general, the notion of afterlife, and impact on health. First of all, we want to be thinking about how different religions view afterlife, if at all. We can't necessarily assume, unless we have knowledge otherwise, that every religion that exists has a view of afterlife or has an afterlife as part of its belief framework, but many of them do, and you may already be able to think of some even as this question is being posed to you. Secondly, in thinking about that health piece, think about how religious views of afterlife can and do or might influence people's health. As we did with the previous lecture, let's zero in on the Bible itself and views of afterlife that are in biblical texts. How do various biblical texts, plural, express hopes, plural, for an afterlife, or for afterlives, plural? And what I would mean by this is, as we did with biblical perspectives on death, when we read an individual biblical passage, let's try to read it and guard the integrity of that biblical passage and its perspective on afterlife before we go necessarily influencing that text from other biblical texts that may have a slightly different perspective on afterlife. So it's the idea of letting individual biblical texts try to speak with integrity before you try to work out all the relationships between them when you bring them together and do some thinking with all of them together. Secondly, how do biblical texts about afterlife influence views of life and death? That is, if in these biblical texts, when you see how they portray afterlife, how do these views of afterlife influence the way people think about how they live and how they face death and what they think about death? And then thirdly, we return to our health question on how these different perspectives on afterlife and the way they influence living and dying, how these perspectives might influence health in the way you live life and face death. So I sent you to some texts both from the Old Testament and the New Testament. A couple of the texts from the Old Testament you looked at were from the book of Isaiah. And Isaiah chapter 26 was the first section. I had you read basically the second half of this chapter and look at some of the things it says about afterlife. And then we get to think about, once again, how health might be influenced by this view of afterlife. Now, we use this term afterlife in some fairly broad, comprehensive, inclusive kinds of ways. This word doesn't actually occur in a text like Isaiah 26. So when we use this, let's understand we're using a convenient umbrella term under which we are putting all kinds of different perspectives of what happens to people after they die. In Isaiah 26, the context of this chapter as a whole is a context of judgment. That God is judging His own people. He is in covenant with His people. His people have made agreements as to how they will live and what they will do and not do in the world because of their relationship with God. And they have violated this covenant. They have violated their commitments and obligations to God. And because of this, they incur God's judgment. But that judgment of God comes in some very concrete forms. Such as political and military destruction of the kingdom of Judah. And this puts us in about the 600s BC, where the kingdom of Judah as a political entity in covenant with God is suffering from incursions from other foreign international powers. So there is a political and military dimension in this text. And when you read verses 11 through 21, you will detect if you pay attention to the language, you will detect ways in which political and military fates are involved in this judgment that's come from God on God's people. That's the context to frame your understanding for what is said in Isaiah 26. Within this, there are perspectives on death articulated. One is that there is a statement made early on in the portion of text that you read, a statement made that suggests that death is a final situation. That those who die, that's their end. That's all that's anticipated for them. And so death is not just this, kind of not worry about it, big deal, there's much more coming. Death is something of a final situation for you. It is your end. That seems to be something that is expressed in this text. It is a fact of life. It's a very, the way it is talked about, and this may be somewhere around verse 14, but the way it's talked about is rather matter of fact. This is a fact of life. It happens to everybody. But this is also a result of God's judgment in this particular case. And again, if you're reading carefully, you can pick up on the ways in which these particular deaths that they are concerned about, yes, everyone dies, it's a fact of life, but the particular deaths that concern them here are deaths that are sooner than they need to be, because they come as God's judgment on them, and they come as God's judgment in the form of political and military destruction and conquest. And so Judah's soldiers are dying, Judah's politicians are dying sooner than they would have had they been left alone to live to a nice old age. And so the deaths that concern them here are God's judgment. So much later in this text, one of the things that Isaiah says is, "You're dead." This is Isaiah speaking to God in a sense. "Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise." He could be speaking to God, or he could be speaking to his collective people, the people of Judah. "You're dead, Judah. Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. The earth will give birth to those long dead." So by saying your dead shall live, that statement by itself doesn't say a lot about what kind of view of afterlife is going on here. But when that's followed up by their corpses shall rise, we're talking about bodies that have been buried in the ground. Their corpses shall rise. Those bodies shall come out of the ground. Something that is depicted in this piece of artwork, I think this is European Renaissance period artwork here, if I'm not mistaken. But you can see down in the lower part of the picture, you really do have some skeletons, human skeletons, and then you have human bodies literally emerging from the ground. Which is why this is a useful metaphor over here when it says that the earth will give birth. This idea is that when these people are emerging from the ground, it's as if the earth itself is giving birth to them. And so this is a very tangible view of afterlife, where it's not just some invisible, intangible part of you that lives on after death. That's not what's being described here. What's being described here are dead bodies emerging from the ground to live again. And this is what we will later come to refer to as resurrection. But this is lurking already in the Old Testament. It's not a very prevalent view. When you read the Old Testament carefully, you're not going to find this perspective in many texts at all. But it is here in one of Israel's prophets, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 26. So then, think about health, how a person's health might be influenced by this view of afterlife. The idea that when I die, my body's going to be put into the ground and it's going to decay and rot. My corpse. But that my corpse can rise, that the earth will give birth to those who are dead, even those who have been dead for a very, very long time. And so one appropriate setting for us to do our interpreting of a text like this is to go to a graveyard, either a generic graveyard or a military graveyard, and just imagine, stand in that graveyard and imagine corpses emerging from the ground. That's what's in view here. That's the view of afterlife, is that your body will live again. That's the perspective. Later in Isaiah 65, in a way that dovetails nicely with the text you just read, you read about new heavens and a new earth that God will create. Here it's depicted rather nicely. Again, these are ancient Near Eastern people, so that they don't have the view of the earth as a sphere, as a globe, like we do. But if we can keep that in mind, that their cosmology was different, and we addressed that in the last lecture, I like this picture, this artistic depiction of an old earth transitioning some way. It's a little bit fuzzy. but there is also continuity. It's not a complete wall. It's not a complete break where you have Earth number one and Earth number two, and there's nothing. There's no continuity between the two, but rather there is that what's going on here eventuates into this Earth over here. There are new heavens, this passage anticipates, but it also anticipates a new earth. And this is something that many Christian readers frequently miss about the Bible. It's there in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, is that the view of afterlife in some of these passages is a new earth. It includes a new earth. So it's not just going to heaven, as so many Christians and Christian preachers and pastors and so many Christian songs and hymns and worship songs describe. It's not just about heaven, it's new heavens and a new earth being depicted in Isaiah 65 and later on in Revelation, along with other texts in the Old and New Testament. Think about the activities that you see going on in Isaiah 65. So, for instance, in verse 21, it describes the people who live in these new heavens and new earth and in this new Jerusalem city that's being described in this text, that people are going to build houses and plant vineyards. And this is a very physical afterlife. Houses that you actually use your hands and materials to build and plant vineyards. Why are you going to plant vineyards? Well, because you're going to eat what they produce. You're going to eat the grapes that grow on the grapevines in these vineyards. So very interesting. And again, think about how this compares and contrasts with typical views of afterlife that tend to predominate certain populations of Christians in the modern Western world. Then think about the participants who are involved in this. Yes, you have lots of people who are participating in this new earth and this life of building houses and planting vineyards, but you also have animals there. So you have the wolf and the lamb feeding together, this peaceable, peaceful, harmonious living that pervades even the animal world. So it's not only the inclusion of animals in this afterlife, in this very physical afterlife, but it's the inclusion of animals in a peaceable existence. Animals aren't harming one another. Humans aren't harming one another. This is the view of afterlife here. So how might this view of afterlife influence people's health? We move then into two New Testament texts. I took you first to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, and this is a letter that Paul is writing to a church in first century Thessalonica. Paul the Apostle, who went on several missionary journeys and was eventually executed by the Roman government. But the purpose of the text, or what he writes about the afterlife in chapter 4, verses 13 through 18, is to encourage one another. So it's a pastoral comfort kind of goal. That is, it's not like Paul sits down one day and says, I'm just going to think about the afterlife because I think that would be cool. Now, the whole reason he writes about afterlife here is because it's been prompted by the concerns and the fears of a particular community of believers. There are some Christians who apparently have lost loved ones. This is what you pick up on in verse 13. So you have Christians who have lost loved ones before Jesus has returned. That's a key belief going on here. And they've lost these loved ones, and because these loved ones are already dead before Jesus comes back, they wonder what their fate is going to be. Are they going to be left out of and excluded from the things that Jesus does when Jesus comes back? That's the real concern here, and it distresses these people. And so Paul's writing to comfort and reassure them and to clarify certain teachings for them. And so one of the things Paul says that is supposed to be a tremendous source of comfort and encouragement for them is that the dead in Christ, those people that this community is concerned about, they will rise first. When Jesus comes back, they're not going to be left out. They're going to be the first ones to rise from the dead. And then we who are alive, note that Paul uses we. He includes himself in this, and so maybe he anticipates that this will happen before he dies. But we who are alive will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord. There's a lot that could be said about this text, including frequent misunderstandings of this text in contemporary versions of rapture theology, if that means anything to any of you. This is a frequently misunderstood text. There is a rapture going on here, but it's not some sort of worldwide instant disappearance of lots of people. What's happening here is that dead people are being raised, as depicted in this grave right here, where a person has been raised from his or her grave, and you have all kinds of people being reunited with loved ones who have died. So you've got this reunion of the living and the dead. That's the key emphasis here, is that the dead and the living are reunited here in this picture. And you have a depiction of Jesus returning with angelic hosts, trumpets announcing Jesus' return, and this great reunion. It's appropriate that there's a graveyard in this scene. But this great reunion of the living and the dead bodies raised, the living are being transformed, they reunite with each other, they welcome Jesus back. And so this is the view of afterlife that is meant to bring comfort and consolation and hope to these people. So think about how this view of afterlife might influence people's health. This idea that those who are dead could be raised from the dead, their bodies could be brought back to life, a new kind of life, and that they could be reunited with their living loved ones. Lastly, we looked at Revelation 20 and 21, chapter 20 verse 11 through chapter 21 verse 8. The book of Revelation as a whole is this collection of symbolic visions that a disciple of Jesus named John had while he was exiled on the island of Patmos. Exiled there by representatives of the Roman government, persecuting him because he was a Christian. And in the particular visions that John sees and writes about in the text you read, these are scenes of God judging the dead being assigned to different destinies or different fates. But you also have this text about a new heaven and a new earth being depicted here, where note you have this movement from what was before to what comes after, where you have this dry, decaying earth and then this lush green earth. This movement from red, ominous darkness into radiant light. So new heaven and a new earth. Remember, we saw this in passages from Israel in the Old Testament in Isaiah 65. We see that it's still here in the New Testament in Revelation 21. Again, I want to emphasize a new earth is part of the Christian hope of the afterlife being depicted here. In terms of life in the new creation, what you see going on in chapter 21 is that God will be present and dwell with people in a way that is stronger and better than his presence in the previous creation. He will wipe every tear from people's eyes, whatever reasons for which they may be crying. This statement, by the way, about wiping away every tear, this is something that also comes from the Old Testament in an Isaiah text that I did not take you to. But it's there in the Old Testament and the New Testament as well. Death will be no more mourning, crying, and pain. So you get the sense of what kind of afterlife is being imagined here. So again, how would it influence people's health if they really believed that there's a possible future for them that will involve a new earth where their bodies will live and dwell with God and with other people, where they won't cry anymore, where they won't die anymore, where they won't have suffering and pain? How could that kind of hope influence people's health? So then, as with our last lecture, I direct you to our discussion board where you're going to select one of these four texts we just covered, and you're going to make an argument for how that text could relate to the health of people who take on that view as their own. I hope this has been helpful for you, and let me also use this opportunity to say this is going to round out week 9, and week 10 is pretty much our final exam, our general education capstone assessment, and course evaluation, and then you're done. And so I want to congratulate you on making it this far and want to encourage you to hang on. You're almost there.